All right. Thank you very much, Anna. Thanks for hosting. Everybody, thanks for being here. Really looking forward to this discussion. So we are going to be talking today about the relationship of progress and education and some topics at that intersection. Let me just begin by introducing our panel. So we've got three folks joining us today to chat about this. First up is Lisa VanDamme. Wave to us, Lisa. She is the founder of VanDamme Academy, a private K-8 school in Orange County. She has also created a wonderful program, which I would love for her to take a couple of minutes sometime today to tell you about, called Read With Me, which is a literature program. We also have with her, also from VanDamme Academy, Kyle Steele, the head of school there. And then our third panelist is Ray Girn, who is the founder of Higher Ground Education, which is a network of schools, including some Montessori schools, Guidepost Montessori, and also a high school, the Academy of Thought and Industry. Just for context, Ray and I have actually been working together on a quote-unquote progress studies program at the high school level. And so, you know, that is part of sort of our answer to some of the general topics here. But looking forward to a really interesting discussion. And almost forgot to introduce myself. I'm Jason Crawford. I am your host. I am the author of The Roots of Progress at rootsofprogress.org, where I write about the history of technology and the philosophy of progress. So that's kind of what we're talking about here with an intersection of education. These folks are really, honestly, some of the deepest thinkers I know on any topic, but especially on the philosophy and the practice of education. They are widely read in the philosophy of it and have spent 10 or 20 years now, each of them, I would say, thinking about this topic, and also putting it into practice in actual schools. So they are philosophers and practitioners, and I think that's the perfect combination to talk to us today. Okay, great. I'm going to just open up with a general question, and we will take this wherever it leads. One of the things I have talked about in my work is that I think that people take progress for granted. The technological and industrial economic progress, sort of modern industrial civilization, our standard of living today, I think people don't appreciate it fully, don't know where it comes from. And so I would love to start asking the panel, do you agree with this premise? And if so, how does this relate to education? Is this a failure of education? Anybody would like to raise a hand to start? Who'd like to jump in first?
Well, I'll jump in just to break the ice a little bit.
Please do.
That notion is progress underappreciated or taken for granted is definitely one that I have sympathy with, and it's something that I could very easily hear myself. I could say to myself, you know, as I'm strolling through social media and seeing headlines and opinion pieces that rub me the wrong way. And it's something that I also try to address in my own classroom. I've been a history teacher for many years, and when I get to, especially to the 18th and 19th century, I really enjoy talking about the rapid changes in standard of living and really getting into the nuts and bolts of steam engines and all of that. Nuts and bolts, not trying to be a pun there, but
good one.
And then as far as the question, is it a failing of education? My thought on it is yes, but maybe not in the sense that you might think. It's not so much, as I see it, it's not that there's a discrete set of facts about progress that were supposed to be delivered and they weren't delivered. Rather, because you could say that about an awful lot of things. You know, it's a common phrase, why didn't I learn X in school? Why didn't I learn budgeting in school? Why didn't I learn X, Y, and Z in school? I think that the project of education is there's a core set of skills and a core body of knowledge that we want to give children so that they can easily add things to it. Among those would be an understanding of progress in the world that they live in. And I think that that's the failure that we see in schools a lot today, that curriculum has become watered down or distracted. And as a consequence, they don't have that, they don't have the skills and the knowledge to easily add whatever the future demands of them, whether it's a knowledge of progress or a knowledge of any number of other topics.
Yeah. Great. I would love to go into more detail about what that means, but first I'd love to give Ray and Lisa a chance to jump in with their thoughts.
Lisa, go ahead.
Lisa,
One
yeah,
quick
go
thought
ahead.
I have is that I can't remember exactly how you phrased the question. Maybe you can get back to the exact phrasing of it, but there's something about the basic approach of it that troubles me. I see X problem in the cultural conversation right now. Therefore, should we look at reworking education to address that problem? And that's where you get into when Kyle was talking about the kind of proliferation of topics that could fall under that heading. It seems to approach education from a specific agenda, and it might be one that's particularly concerning to you from your context. Where I would look at it more as education being the project of creating people able to think rationally, thoughtfully, from an informed perspective, coherently about an infinite variety of topics, and that then when they become adults, you're able to address this gap in their understanding and know that you're dealing with a person capable of reasoning about that issue with you.
Yeah. Ray?
So I agree with everything that Kyle and Lisa have said. I mean, just to start with the first half of your question, it's not that progress is taken for granted. There's a Cold War against the idea of technology being a good as against kind of living standards. I think the fact that maybe I'm extreme in my views, but the fact that we seriously debate, whether modern technology is good, it's an undebatable good, right? And so it's an indictment of something, and probably our education system. But again, I think it's complex, how what the implications are. I think that if you look at education generally, ideas generally, in a kind of a very broad sense, yes, it's a failure of the education system. It's what's being taken for granted is not really, is technology good? It's being taken for granted. What's kind of underneath that, what the debate is about is whether choice and agency are good. What is the nature of meaning in life, right? Like, why is there such alienation from prosperity? Why does prosperity cause alienation, right? I mean, we live in kind of a time of unimaginable wealth, and these issues are shaped, directly and indirectly, deeply by education. Just as one quick example, take social media, right? And the idea of social media being addictive and being a problem, and what social media and technology generally represents, in my view, is like unimaginable choice, like literally choice at your fingertips every moment of the day. And the problem is that our educational system has not trained us to be able to handle that much choice. Like I look at someone, say like my wife, who I think was well educated in a kind of from kind of throughout every level, like she's not I can't get her addicted to Twitter, and like I try and I just can't seem to get her. And I think that comes from, I mean, she has this kind of Oscar Wilde, like that's not, which is not good for me, doesn't tempt me. And I think that like we can trace that back to the fact that she had long periods of uninterrupted concentration over and over and over again. And so a lot of times the kind of the form in which education is at play here is really like a certain type of character, a certain type of intellect, a certain ability to parse apart issues hasn't been developed. And so I think that's the way in which education is really is the cause of taking progress for granted.
Can I ask a point of
clarification
for moving the conversation from here? Can we clearly define what we mean by progress? Are we talking about industrial and technological progress? Are we talking about progress per se? I think really getting greater clarity on that question will help shape the conversation in a productive direction.
Yeah, I think the most basic and easily established fact of progress is the enormous rise in living standards over the last 200 plus years, which is kind of the most easy to see and I think easy to establish and directly measurable. Very close behind that, I think, is the progress in technology, which is kind of the most proximate cause of the living standards. And perhaps very close behind that is the growth of our knowledge in science, particularly the physical sciences, that have been underneath a good amount of that technology. So I think at least those three things are fairly clear. There is if you zoom out, there is a broader story of progress that I think is less clear and harder to establish, which includes progress at a philosophic level, progress in reason and how it is deployed in society, progress in moral issues, social and government issues. I think that's a lot fuzzier, at least. But at minimum, I think you can zoom in and you can say that technological and industrial progress have led to enormous leaps in at least physical living standards over the last couple hundred years, and that much is sort of very, very establishable. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So the question that we're trying to address here, or the question you are asking, is that aspect of progress neglected in schools, or is people's failure to appreciate that aspect of progress a consequence of some neglect in schools?
Yeah. And so I think you and Lisa and Kyle both pointed to a view on this, which is, if I can try to sum it up, is if people fail to appreciate progress in some way, that is, and if that is related to education, it is more related to how we teach them to think, to face the world, to comprehend it, rather than a sort of very direct kind of like, well, we should have taught this exact thing in a class. And so I would love to, maybe we can just go to how does a good education prepare someone to deal with issues that they were never taught, that were not directly addressed in school?
You said, how does a good education prepare them to encounter things that they weren't taught in school?
Yeah, exactly. Which seemed to be the direction that you were pointing to, right?
Well, I would say that a good education is, I want to talk about some of the core skills and some of the core knowledge, and there can be a lot of debate about the specifics and the what is and isn't on the list. But a solid K through 12 education would give students a good grounding in mathematics, history, science, literature. It would help them to develop skills, how to put their thoughts into writing, how to speak about their thoughts, how to carry on a discussion, how to listen carefully to someone else, and how to read material carefully and parse numerical data carefully. And so a student that has, or really an adult that had a K-12 education that gave them that knowledge and those skills, well, when signals in their adult life indicate to them, I want to pay more attention to X, then they'll have the skill set to gather new information, and they'll have a core of knowledge that they can plug that information to more readily. For example, just this week, I had to research HVAC systems because I have to figure out how to make our school more safe in light of coronavirus. Now, I would not say, why didn't I learn about HVAC systems in school? Instead, I would be grateful that I was given the ability to do research, to look through numerical data, to vet sources, and thus there were signals in my adult life that X, Y, and Z knowledge was useful to me. And because of the educational background I had, I was able to get that knowledge and plug it back in with the rest of my knowledge.
One term I find very helpful that we use a lot at VanDamme Academy is the concept of intellectual disciplines, which we got from an educator named Arthur Bester. And basically, he describes the fundamentals of a good grade school education, or a liberal education is what he's talking about, as looking out over the accumulated wisdom of centuries and saying, great thinkers have conceptualized the world. They've been able to understand, to explain, to conceptualize the world in all these different respects, from a scientific perspective, from a historical perspective, from a literary or artistic perspective, and that these have sort of fallen into certain disciplines of thought that give us a unique perspective, vantage point, access to understanding of the world. And that what we need to do is identify what is that set of fundamental disciplines, which I think roughly correlates with the list of subjects that Kyle just enumerated, and take each of those disciplines and help the child, the student, to develop that discipline of thought. And then they're armed with a perspective that allows them to look at and take on the world from a number of different perspectives with a number of different skills. So one thing I think that when you ask about progress, the fundamental understanding that I think you want a child to have about the world in terms of progress would come out of history or would come out of science if it were taught properly. They would see, but that the goal should be to help them develop that intellectual discipline and not to try to generate intellectual allies in terms of the conclusions that you want them to have. Yeah,
certainly. I think that's a good basic premise for all of education. This is a fascinating concept, this idea of intellectual disciplines, and I haven't heard it formulated that way. I would love to, can you just explain more? I mean, I understand history as a subject in school. I understand it as a class, but how do I understand it as an intellectual discipline in this? That sounds like a grander concept.
So I think Kyle should answer it in regard to history.
Sure.
Maybe I can take it on in regard to literature. We'll have a division of labor here.
Yeah, it's hard for me to stand on one foot and explain it as a discipline right off the cuff, but to understand history as a discipline, it's not just history as an accumulation of dates and events and a chronicle of what happened in the past, but the ability to look at firsthand sources and to figure out from them aspects of about the culture and about the way of life. It's the ability to look at causal chains through human events and maybe even try to find patterns in the causal chains in human events. And so history as a discipline is not just giving you the facts that are history, the dates and so forth, but it's also giving you a way of thinking about that material. And that way of thinking can be valuable in a whole variety of settings, you know. Maybe it'll be metaphorical, where you'll say, oh, well, this conflict that I'm having with my landlord is like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I don't know if that's a weird example, but something along those lines, where in studying history as a discipline and thinking of it as a discipline, there's a way of thought that goes along with it. I think that we understand this really clearly with things like the law. People talk about this a lot when they go to law school. They're not just learning the laws, they're learning a legal way of thinking and a legal way of looking at the world. And it can be a powerful tool of analysis. Am I hitting the things that you're thinking of, Lisa?
Yeah, definitely. So we sometimes say, out of history, you learn to think like a historian, which I think means seeing broad themes as explanatory of the events that you're witnessing on a big scale, and seeing that on a big scale. So there's a distinct value and outlook and skill set that comes out of looking at the world like a historian. And I think the same is true in literature and art, that the artist's unique gift is the ability to take life, extract a certain understanding or principle or aspect of life that they really want to make powerfully palpable, tangible, real to you. And so they can strip down a story to essentials that convey that theme, that outlook on the world in a really compelling and distilled way, stripped of any sort of anything accidental or anything interfering with your understanding of that experience. And that what that can do is enable you to walk away with this kind of X-ray vision on the world, where this particular author gave you this outlook and understanding of human nature, of how the world works, that you bring to bear on your experience thereafter. And that experience is something that's uniquely brought out in reading a great novel or looking at a classic painting. And when the student has been exposed to that skill again and again and again, then they have that to bring to bear on their everyday life afterward. So it's a unique skill set and discipline that comes out of the study of literature or art.
Let me ask at least one follow-up to you two about this concept, and then maybe I'll circle around to Ray for his comments. Is there something, when we, just take an example to go back to, say, history, when we talk about history as learning to think like a historian, is that something that just naturally comes out of teaching history well? Or is it something maybe that you have to go beyond teaching history well or add on to? Do you see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
I think what you're saying is, will you learn to think like a historian just by taking history classes, or does the teacher need to give you explicit instruction?
If they're good history classes that are not just names and dates, but give you a conceptual understanding, and the assignments force you to grapple with causal narratives and sort of all the things that you might just think are a good part of learning history. Is that what is needed to learn to think like a historian, or is there something above and beyond?
I would say that for the most part, you pick that up through, let's call it osmosis, that through the course of studying. We've been talking about history, but we could say literature or science classes or mathematics. You know, we're learning about this scientific phenomenon, and then thinking like a scientist comes through osmosis. But there is also a necessity for there to be explicit identifications, especially as kids get older and are capable of more abstract thinking. Like, all right, so you've been looking at observing the world and you've been conducting experiments. Now we're actually going to talk about the experimental method. Or now we're going to talk about what separates good mathematical thought from bad mathematical thought. But you don't do that in kindergarten. That comes after a lot of experience and osmosis, like I was saying.
Yeah,
and I just wanted to clarify one thing that I said earlier. I am worried that I came across as a little too extreme. When I said that it's not a failure to deliver certain facts about progress, I do think that the average instruction in history does not feature aspects of technological progress, cultural progress. I even like to talk about with my, it's hard to make exciting, but I talk to them about insurance and loans and financial instruments. But that's also a part of progress over the past centuries that I do think that gets short shrift in history education. I hope that what I said earlier doesn't make it sound like none of that belongs. Yeah,
sure. Okay, that'll be really interesting to come back to. But Ray, let me just let you kind of have a chance to comment on some of this.
Sure. I mean, an analogy for kind of this perspective on disciplines, and I do think Arthur Bester is great. I think everyone should read Educational Wastelands if you're looking kind of for a book that captures this perspective. I think I don't know if you said, Kyle, there's something else, that's the one that you would recommend. Yeah. I use the analogy of a lens. Like what you're doing when you're learning is you're building a lens. You look at the world differently. You see the world through this lens, and you acquire this lens through. And so I do think how you present the knowledge, what types of assignments, what you sensitize children to matters tremendously. And just to, because I like to talk about my kids, just to use an example, like, my son, when he was 4.5 or 5, like we were scrambling eggs. I have 2 boys. And he said, Daddy, like there's 3 of us, so we'll get 1/3 of the eggs each, right? And I said, as a joke, I'm twice as big as you guys, so I should get 2/3 and you guys can share the other 2/3. I should get twice as much. And he looks at me, he's like, but Daddy, that would be 4 times as much. And I was like, whoa, like where did that come from, right? And it's like, because the way that he's learning math, the way that he's learning fraction is making that type of thing pop. And I think there's a learning science there that we as a species, right, like everyone, all of us, we're not that good at. And there's a lot of room for pedagogical innovation. But in the end, what you end up with is like you can't unsee the world, like not through that lens once you've acquired it. And I do think, I agree that it maps on to these broad categories of science and literature and mathematics. If you think about math, think about trying to decide whether or not to get divorced, right? And what's at play in making that decision? Like it's if you have a relational algebraic capacity, whether or not you've taken a day of algebra, that is the systematic way to develop it. If you have that capacity, you discount the value of time. You isolate certain, variables while you assess other ones. You do all sorts of things. That's the machinery of human thought. And so, like, it's that capacity that we're trying to develop in children. And I would say, like, for me, like, the broad purpose of education is really developing the capacity to know, the capacity to kind of learn and know, which requires a lot of knowledge, requires a lot of skills. There's a whole bunch of things that it requires. And I think the general capacity to act. And I think that would maybe be an interesting thing to discuss, but there's this general capacity to act in the world. Like our ideal is mind-guided, thought-guided action, right? It's not just the content of that. We're preparing the man, not just preparing the mind. It's kind of the way that I put it. And there's all sorts of skills and knowledge and tools and inspiration and experiences that add up to that. The way that it looks like at a school when I visit, if you just want to say, if you have 30 seconds or 30 minutes to look, the two kind of overarching signals, markers of quality are, we call it a culture of knowledge and a culture of work. And it's really the combination of those two. And once you can spot it, you can spot it very quickly. Like, is this a bull session, or is there a real culture of knowledge, a real quest for truth? Is this like people kind of like the fleeting kind of impulse of the moment, or is there a real disciplined culture of work, right, of persistence? And you can't get all the way with just those 2 points, but you can get very far, if you just look for those two markers of kind of quality education.
Fascinating. Your story about the
Ray, I might take them.
Your story about the omelet is giving me flashbacks to my Montessori education, where you learn about fractions with the metal circle with the pie slices, and I'm just thinking about those things.
And if I may, very quickly, that just reminded me of something. So like the point about the lens, right? Like, so when I took my Montessori training, it's very good because this is a simple example, but the same point applies to anything more abstract. So I took my training. It was in San Diego. I live in Orange County, so it's like a 90-minute drive, and there's triangles. There's this activity where you got to trace triangles, geometric shapes, and then put them in, in sets and take them out. And you do this for 30 minutes, and okay, you can imagine do this. And then I'm driving home, and everywhere I look, all I see are squares and triangles and rectangles, and they just pop out at you like they're like, and it's like, now imagine that in the mind of a 3-year-old, right? And now, the point is, are the headlines in the New York Times starting to get more nationalistic? Like, it's the same point. If you're sensitized to certain issues, they pop. You're aware. You can grapple with them, and so it is. I think pretty fundamental. This view of I don't know if lens is the right analogy, or discipline. Like, it's a way of seeing the world. It is not a body of content that you can just like memorize and draw upon. Although it is that too, but it's not primarily that.
Yeah. Okay, so part of what we're talking about here sounds a little bit like something that is very often and very broadly discussed, which is the notion of teaching students, quote unquote, critical thinking skills, or something along those lines, right? So, I would argue that there's some notion out there in the broad, in US education today, that critical thinking skills are a good idea. There's something that kids should get from school. We should teach them. Is there a difference between that notion and this sort of grander sounding notion of intellectual disciplines, or what you all are talking about? And, and sort of like, why, if it's generally agreed perhaps that we should be teaching critical thinking skills, why are we failing to do it?
I can see Kyle wanting to jump on this.
Well, it's another one of those where if you look at it at first brush, you think critical thinking skills. That sounds wonderful. I would love it for people to be able to think critically, and I do think people should think more critically. But my experience, both as a teacher and as a student, when someone was trying to teach me critical thinking skills, it sounds like it's a very top-down approach to trying to create what we're all describing here. It sounds like, well, you know, these kids, they don't look at things closely enough. They don't think carefully enough. So let's make a curriculum that's called critical thinking, and we'll tell all of the drones in the school system to teach it, and then they'll know critical thinking skills. Whereas what Ray and Lisa and I are talking about is a much more bottom-up approach, where we have these beautiful Montessori materials, or these excellent pieces of literature, or the most gripping pieces of history, and through the presentation of that content, by selecting excellent content, critical thinking is more of an emergent skill that the children gain, rather than being something that just kind of comes in from the Board of Education because it's the thing that they heard on NPR. I'm being a little too cynical.
Yeah.
I should pump the brakes.
I try to imagine what it would be like to teach artistic thinking skills without teaching a book. You know, instead of having them read a great work of literature, discuss the characters, discuss the themes, live in that world, have the experience of what it is to read a great novel. Now we're going to put the books aside, and we're just going to learn. We can, you know, skip ahead and bypass the tedium of having to actually read a novel and just extract the methodology that's supposed to come out of that experience. Well, I don't think that would work, and you would actually lose the real value of that experience in trying to do that.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, the distinction between there's a valid like place to distinguish between content and methodology and look at one in isolation, but they don't actually kind of live as separate things. And the critical thinking is thinking, right? Like I don't know, the word critical, I'm not sure what it adds, right, to thinking. And so we're training thinking in everything we do. And this is partly where, if you don't see education, if you know, like the false alternative is education is opinion versus education is propaganda. And the third way is education is thinking. And then you can debate about what that looks like. You know, we have differences, but that, you know, I mean, all of education is critical thinking. So, you know, I'm not,
Yeah. Sorry, can you elaborate on that last bit? You said the false dichotomy, education as propaganda versus education as, did you say opinion?
Opinion, yeah. So it's kind of, I mean, that's just what I see as out there, right? I mean, generally you have education as, and there's more subtle and more kind of obvious forms of this, but education is like, the answers are in the back of the book. I want to see the student, you know, arrive at the same conclusion as me. Like, that's my ultimate agenda. However, you know, I might be creative in doing it, right? Because I have the one true faith, right? And then the alternative to that is, you know, there's anything goes, right? Like, I just want the student to kind of generate somehow out of know-how, really, you know, his or her own conclusions and his or her own ideas, and they just oscillate between each other, you know, and one becomes the other. People that are kind of more on the kind of progressive side and kind of more focused on, you know, opinion is important, as creativity is important, tend to default, when they do care about some content, tend to default to the education as propaganda approach. It's still their model of what it means to learn.
If you're thinking properly, if you're thinking correctly, you should arrive at the same conclusion. You should actually have a different.
David?
Yeah. Oh,
sorry, can I want to wait to we've got some extra time. I want to hold sort of audience questions and comments to the end, if you don't mind. Yeah, no worries. No worries.
Yeah.
Good to see you though. Sorry, where were we?
Ray was talking about one side being all about indoctrination, the other side being about opinion, and then thinking being the third path.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. So sorry, did Ray, were you done with your comment?
I was done. I mean, since David made that point, let me just it's out there now, so let's answer it. That was a good question. And then we can save the debate later. I agree with that.
No
If you're
worries.
thinking properly, you are going to arrive at the same conclusion. It's just that it's not about that, and knowledge is complex, and whether the United States was created on the principle of freedom, or whether it's the result of kind of exploitation of human labor. I'm not of the view that there isn't a right answer here, but it's complex. The purpose in education is to ensure that students can look at two competing narratives and can navigate the process of identifying what they think, and not about getting to the answer. That's kind of...
So let's go into maybe a more concrete example. So one thing that I think about as a modern example is like energy policy. So, where do we get our energy from is like a major issue that people talk a lot about today. It's at the intersection of science, technology, industry, politics, and a number of different, disciplines like this. And I see a lot of people talking about this and forming opinions without knowing basic facts of context that you would think would be needed to have an opinion on these topics, such as where do we get our energy from today? Like, what is the current breakdown? Why is that the breakdown? What are the characteristics of different energy sources, such as their, the total amount of energy worldwide they can generate, or the consistency and reliability of that energy, whether they can generate it 24 hours a day, or whether they have fluctuations up and down. What are the needs of energy from energy uses? Can energy be stored? Can it be transmitted? So there's kind of all these just like, sort of basic facts. So I will grant you all that it's it's not necessarily that these very specific facts should have been taught in school and then they weren't in a class and now people don't know them. But so how would an ideal education prepare people to tackle this issue? And what I'm hearing from you all is it would somehow give people the idea that if they don't know these facts, these are at least relevant questions to ask, and they should go ask them and kind of get self-informed. But connect those dots.
I think,
how does that happen?
I think, I'll just start. I think that, like, kind of what Kyle was saying, I think I was alluding to, like, as children get older, as you get into late high school, I do think there is a kind of like stepping back in terms of what is the status of my knowledge? How do I know that I know? These things do become explicit, and I do think one of the things you want to leave with is like the ability to know what you know and know what you don't know, and the ability to, and so while I think we agree that that's not like you need the data, you need the experiences, you need the kind of, don't go to the meta level too quickly. I do think that in the end, as you're the emerging adult, has more, ought to have more of a sense of, what does it even mean to ask a question? What does it even mean to know something? When is testimonial evidence legitimate or not? I think about this a lot, like when somebody tells you something, and if we lived in a different world, I do think that would be, in a sense, in the air, and you would see people engaging in a wholly different type of inquiry and being more dismissed. They would treat more the way that we would respond, or everyone would respond to really quack conspiracy theories. I think more lines of inquiry would elicit that response, because just the standards would be so much higher. I'm not sure if that's clear, but
yeah. Please go ahead.
One thing I often say, one thing I often identify as a fundamental problem of education is that students today seem to look out at the world, say, okay, this is all here, now our job is to form opinions about it. And they don't understand things in terms of origin or causation or history or what it came out of at all, because of the nature of our schools today. And I think addressing that problem would address a lot of the things that you're concerned about, because if they know that they have to look to the causation behind something to deeply understand it, and then all the various other skills that would come into to forming opinions about energy policy, then they're going to be able to look sensibly at that issue in particular. But I do think that comes out of meaningfully learning history, learning this was not, the way energy production has transformed civilization. Look back thousands of years and at just the simple differences in human life, and you will observe that there's a causality behind this, and you have to understand that causality. So I think it's mostly the neglect of history and science meaningfully taught that is at root of the problems you're observing.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to make a weird argument that I teach art appreciation at our school, and I'd like to try to make the case that a good art appreciation curriculum will make more informed voters than trying to give them the knowledge about key voting issues. Because if that's the goal, the one challenge is going to be, I don't know what the big issues of the political issues are going to be 10 years from now when my third graders are voting. But in my art appreciation class, I showed them paintings and I asked them to formulate theories about what's happening or what the theme might be. And then I'm constantly asking them to, well, can you point to the facts, point to the details in the painting that support that way of thinking? And can you draw inferences that build up to your idea of the painting? And so a good education with excellent content, this ties into what Ray was saying, is it's going to get the children to recognize when they don't know things, or be habituated to being able to outline what is behind their thoughts. And so in this art appreciation class where they need to be ready, it's not just a flowery, I think that this is all about the deaths of World War II. That's what this painting's about. It's where they have to be able to point to solid evidence. By doing that more consistently and regularly throughout their education, that will become their habit of mind. And thus, when a new issue comes up that they're poorly informed about, they're not used to the bull sessions where everyone just mouths their opinion. Instead, they're used to thinking more carefully about where their opinion comes from. So if I understand your question correct, Jason, maybe I misunderstood. I think that you're trying to get to how do we make sure that we have good citizens or informed voters on issues related to progress? And that's where I think how I think a quality education fits into that question.
Yeah, makes sense.
I think it also matters, Odad, what's happening in post-secondary education? What are the kind of philosophical ideas? I mean, I remember my wife's U Chicago graduation, this kind of bastion of kind of intellectual inquiry, and the dean stood up there at the commencement and said, there are no right answers. It's not about the truth. It's all about the ongoing dialectic and blah, blah, blah. Like, it's like, yeah. And then fake news is chickens coming home to roost. Like, so, I mean, you can do whatever, like, if to the extent that is the watchword of the age, right? That you're not gonna, I mean, we're not trying to solve that problem in a case. We're trying to, in a sense, indirectly, prepare people to think, but what are the explicit ideas and values matter, is what really fully solving the problem.
Yeah. This has all been fantastic. Thank you all. So we've been talking about maybe sort of the education needed to create good and informed citizens. If we think about something a bit narrower, which is that all of this technological and industrial progress is actually created by a minority, by a certain set of scientists, inventors, business leaders, perhaps political leaders, who go on and create that. I think another question to ask about our education is, are we properly, creating that next set of leaders, in both technical and political, perhaps, who are going to keep pushing progress forward in the next generation. So what kind of educational system do we need to create those technology leaders?
There's something that makes me uncomfortable about the idea of looking at education as having the goal of creating a certain type of person. even though I want that type of person to exist, it's not how I approach looking at what constitutes a proper education. I look at that in terms of empowerment of the individual child and supplying them with this range of lenses or disciplines that will enable them to thrive in their life, whatever that might look like. Now, I do at the same time believe that doing that properly will help to produce the sort of people you're talking about, but I think looking at it from the perspective of trying to generate that sort of person will prompt you to narrowly focus on the creation of that type of person to the neglect of the things that might actually help them to become that sort of person. That's one danger. And then the other is sort of making a cultural need primary as opposed to the individual's needs. So saying this is something that's lacking in culture or that we need to make sure exists in culture. Therefore, I'm not going to look at what's going to arm and empower this human being overall in the living of their life. I'm going to look at the cultivation of that thing that I see as an absence. So I don't think that's what you're suggesting, but I just take caution in kind of phrasing or looking at it that way.
I want to really, second that. I think it's like, you talk about like professional obligations that psychologists and therapists and, lawyers, attorneys have. I mean, we have a professional obligation of educators not to go beyond the kind of individual child and kind of the needs of the individual child. And I've talked to people about this in terms of like, say, like Beethoven and what he would have wanted and what if he wouldn't have gone into music. And it's like, the world be damned and the world loses music. He doesn't want to do it. Like, that has to be our attitude. And I think that you start trying to engineer outcomes like that. Impulse is when you're no longer an educator. You're no longer in the business of like helping, or a parent, by the way. Although it's different, I think it's really the same. Like, you're a passenger in this child's life. You're not the driver, right? And I think I think we could spend a lot of time on that, because I think that's actually fundamental to the identity of an educator that you don't. So I very much agree.
Ray, can I ask you a question about that? Mm-hmm. So is passenger the concept that you would use? And this is the question that I find most fascinating, is there's a certain extent to which my guidance and, from the perspective of the wisdom that I possess and nurturing that wisdom in my child is going to be crucially important. But then that's in terms of some sort of fundamentals in education and in parenting. But I wouldn't want to say passenger, because I'm not just along for the ride watching whatever happens. I do want to give them guidance. So I think differentiating those levels of direction and at the most fundamental level, but still allowing for
and I don't know what the right terminology, the right and kind of metaphor is. When it's passenger with respect to like the specific particular outcome, whether they're a doctor or a lawyer or an entrepreneur, in terms of whether they're like, whether they're living a fully lived life, like, that there's an active role, but it's just that it's at that level of generality. As soon as you try to make it more particular, you're going to go off the rails as a parent or as an educator. That's kind of the way that I put it.
I'm in agreement with what Lisa and Ray have said about how there's something a little funky about trying to. It almost seems like we're trying to engineer the outcome of the child. And a metaphor that I use for it is, I don't want to play like Sim City with their education, where I'm in this God view and I'm trying to get the score of entrepreneurs up. And so I'm going to tweak the system to get the score of entrepreneurs up. Instead, it's you have to look at it at the level of the individual. What is going to help this child for whatever their future is going to hold. And there's something really hubristic about thinking, well, I know what I need that child to be in the future, and I know what civilization needs that child to be in the future. And so now it's my job is to make sure that that outcome is achieved. As the year 2020 has taught us, we don't really know what skills are going to be most necessary in the future, or at least we don't know it as well as we thought.
And nor could we do it even if we wanted to. Like the point is, like, you don't create and manufacture like entrepreneurs. It's you know, you just, I mean, this is the Declaration of Independence kind of premise. Like, you set the conditions and then you get out of the way, and some people run with it and others don't in different directions, and all you can do is set the conditions, right? You can't actually, I mean, you can do some condition setting in a general way, but you can't. I don't know what that look like. What are you going to do if the person wants to be an artist rather than an entrepreneur? Are you going to somehow try to direct them in one direction or another? You can expose them to a variety of things.
But to spin it, to make things a little bit more positive, if we are achieving, you know, the mission of education as we've been talking about, then what we will have is a lot of kids that will be responding to the signals in their environment and figuring out where the best opportunities are and what will bring them a lot of happiness. And so, but the sorts of outcomes that we might want, you know, more entrepreneurs, more inventors, more theoretical innovators, will happen almost as a matter of course.
Yeah.
I would add, Jason,
go ahead, Ray. Yep.
That I think in terms of what you're talking about, I think early education is really important in terms of, like, you just say, how do we, you know, can-do attitude, a kind of willingness to be bold. A lot of these things, they're formed very early. And so if you look at, say, like our infant training, you know, literally with infants, like 6, 8, 9 months old, and we had this video in our training where this little 9-month-old girl, she's reaching for a rattle, and she like almost has it and then pushes it away, and she fusses a little bit and pushes it, and you watch her for like 3 minutes, and finally she gets the rattle, and there's this look of pure joy on her face, right? And then we stop in the training, and then the point is, like, how many of you would have given her that rattle? And you would have, that is what you would have been robbing her of. And if you imagine, you know, in an environment day after day after day after day, where the lesson that you're learning is that the result of active-mindedness and activity is joy, and the result of passivity is boredom, and that is what your environment is optimized to teach you, like, you know, and now you project that as your first 5 years of life, like, you're going to get people that are kind of, you know, entrepreneurial in a very generic sense, right? In a very general sense of, like, they're out there able, you know, active, right?
Yeah. So I love the individualistic perspective here, and agree that we certainly don't want to take individual students and say, all right, we ran our psychology profile, the best way you can serve society is as an engineer. You have been assigned to the department of, you know, nor do we want to have some sort of top-down master plan of here is exactly how many of each type of person we need, and now let us, okay. But at the same time, like, I think there is a positive way to look at this, in that there is a way to create an environment that does bring out the certain natural ambitions of people when they are natural. I mean, Ray, you said something about Beethoven, like, well, what if Beethoven didn't want to play music? Okay, fine, he doesn't have to play music. But I would flip it around. I would say Beethoven obviously loved music and was deeply passionate about it. And what if he had never encountered it, or what if he had missed that opportunity? That would be terrible for him and for the world. And when I look at certain types of geniuses, and when I look at inventors, right, and just to take one specific type of genius, and I look at the inventions that have been created, well, it's not perfectly even throughout history, right? There were long periods of time when there was very little invention going on. Now, is that because there was just sort of naturally nobody who felt like doing invention, or had the capacity for it, or who loved it? I don't think so. I think there was something in the environment, in the world, in the culture, in society, perhaps in education, perhaps in politics. There was something out there that wow, around 1600s, 1700s, certainly by the 1800s, we discovered, hey, society is full of inventors. And it wasn't because anybody had the idea to create a whole bunch of inventors, but something created them, or something in the world changed such that these people, who I presume there was some percentage of in every age, who had this inventive capacity and impulse, suddenly were able to do it. Actually, just on Wednesday, I was interviewing Anton Howes, who's an economic historian, who has done a really detailed study of British inventors from like the 1500s through the 1800s. And one amazing thing that he found was how many of them had some sort of direct personal contact with the previous inventor, that kind of, he presumes, gave them the idea that it was, that you could go off and invent things, and sort of spurred them to that. So all of this is just to say, I do think there's something in creating an environment that will bring this out in people when it is natural and good for the individual, not just good for society. So the modern take on this is that we need STEM education, right? So I feel like you all might have a more nuanced and perhaps grander conception of what exactly that should be.
Is it all right if I jump in on this?
Please. Go ahead.
I hadn't heard about the historian that you're talking about. It sounds really interesting. And when I hear that, what I think is, well, what we need is a society where the nascent Beethoven can meet a piano teacher, and the nascent inventor can meet the previous inventor. And so how do we best enable that kind of sorting? And this is where we can get on the soapbox about liberty and choice in education. What's going to be best for encouraging things like this is that if it's easier for parents and students to start to make choices on their own about what kind of education they receive, what kind of subjects they study. So to talk more specifically about progress and getting people to know about progress so that they can lead further progress, what I love is that you've put together your program it's in the form of a virtual summer camp right now, but you've now got a place where those sort of nascent progress lovers can now meet, and they'll learn about the ideas of what upholds progress and how progress works. So what's necessary in order to facilitate more of that in the future is we need to enable self-selection in education. I don't know if that's a good way to put it, but it needs to be easier for students and parents with certain aptitudes and interests and skills to personalize or calibrate what sorts of things they study. Now, I don't want this to be taken as you can study whatever you want to, and it's all okay. If you don't want to learn to read, you don't have to learn to read. I'm not trying to say that, but there should be right now we have a very narrow system where there's one curriculum, and the methodology is dictated by your zip code, and loosening that up more is going to create the encounters that you're talking about.
Yeah. Jason, when you first asked me if I would participate in this panel to discuss whether progress studies should be addressed in schools, but other people might not, then my answer was yes, I'd be happy to, but is it okay if my answer is no? So that is a reaction against the idea of creating a topic of progress studies and trying to make that its own intellectual discipline, which I don't think it has the status to warrant. That said, I love everything that you're doing. I see the value in it. I see the problems you're identifying. And what I imagine is the most important influential thing is to find the place of that perspective within history and science curriculum and try to influence history and science curriculum in that way. Now, that's assuming that meaningful history and science curriculum exists, which is another question. but to the extent that there is a defined history and science curriculum with a proper approach, finding the place for progress studies as you're conceptualizing, and make sure that that has its proper place in those subjects, I think is the most valuable thing that can be done. My concern would be, like, I remember years ago hearing about an organization creating a unit on Holocaust studies, maybe because of Holocaust deniers, as reaction against that. And then that becomes a 6-month unit where that is the focus of study, and sort of giving an improper balance because we're looking at it from the lens of a problem that needs to be rectified instead of finding its place in the development of fundamental skills.
I would also add, you know, building on those points, and particularly what Kyle was saying in terms of self-selection, it might not be in school. Like, I think part of the problem with high school education is most kids should be working for a few years. Like, you know, like, it's like, I think that, like, I think if you literally are Beethoven, like, you do the minimum you have to, and you spend 8 hours doing, like, I mean, I do think, like, there's demonstrably unique people that run with it, and then you have to figure out how, and that's, you know, part of what a parent has to decide. I mean, there is a common core, right? Like, in the sense that there is a something that I think we all agree that everyone needs, but I don't think that entrepreneurs are getting their inspiration at school. They want to get home from school and tinker in their garage, and, like, you know, and by the time they're 12, somebody like that is 12, 13, 14, 16, I mean, I think that they need, you know, one of the reasons we saw these inventions emerge in the ages is they left home and they did their thing, right? Like, and you were able to do that. I think they need, you know, we need to somehow facilitate the space to do that. I don't think it's that easy to figure out how. So I think it's very easy for that to go wrong, but, you know, but there's something there.
Great. So given the time, I think what I would like to do is give each of you just a little bit of time to talk about your own projects and what you do, which the audience would like to hear about, and I would love for you to tell the audience about. And then let's go to some audience questions. Everyone in the audience, we are taking the questions in Slido. Anna, maybe you want to go ahead and give that link again in the Zoom chat. So Slido lets you enter your question and also lets everybody vote up questions. So go ahead and everybody start taking a look over the questions and vote for whichever ones you think are most interesting. And that way we'll get, you know, we'll make sure we're addressing some of the popular topics. So you can start doing that now. What we're going to do, by the way, just to make it a little more personal, is I'm going to pick the questions off the Slido list, and I will invite you to sort of read it or speak it aloud. That way we get kind of some faces and voices in here. And so just be ready to kind of unmute and speak up when I call you. But yeah, I would love to, who would like to start and say a little about, I'd love for you to just tell everybody about the schools that you run, and some special programs and so forth. Anybody want to raise a hand and start off?
Well,
mine is short and simple. Okay. I'll go quickly, and then you. I started a book group app called Read With Me, and the idea of it actually came about because I was communicating with a friend on Facebook, and she said, I really want to read Cyrano de Bergerac, but I don't feel capable of reading it on my own. I wish I had guidance. And I said, oh, I should start some sort of Read With Me book group where you can just read it along with me, and I'll talk to you about it as we go. And then 24 hours later, I thought, okay, that's my next project. I have to create that. So the app, I say the goal of it is to help people connect emotionally with the classics, because connect emotionally and classics is not something that a lot of people put together. They usually think of classics as some sort of cultural obligation that they have to kind of drearily force their way through, or else it feels inaccessible or over their heads somehow, or you're one of the lucky people who just already has the capacity for that. But most of us were not taught how to connect emotionally with the classics. So it's just it's a curated list of works that I think are actually really well worthwhile for everybody. I read a chapter or a couple chapters at a time. You can listen to it on audio. And then I have a discussion after each chapter that's meant to not look at it from a historical perspective, not look in terms of literary devices, not dissect it into a carcass, but to help you get the personal, meaningful, spiritual, inspirational value out of that chapter and kind of help you figure out what to focus on at each given point. So that's my thing right now.
And let me just add, I've been a very happy user. One of the most amazing things about this program is that it's free. Lisa has a Patreon where people support it, but so I've been a very happy user of this, and I don't know anybody other than who's better than Lisa at actually just taking these classics, which seem they do seem like work, you know, and then Lisa, you make it not work, or at least you make it much the emotional return on intellectual investment is much higher when I've got you as a guide. So I just want to recommend that to everybody. Readwithmevolunteers.com is not it. Lisa, what's the right?
It's readwithmesalon.com.
There we go. All right. And Lisa is also the founder of a school where Kyle's head of school. Maybe Kyle, you would just want to tell us about the school.
Sure, yeah. I don't have any projects to speak of. I'm not on Twitter. I don't have a podcast. I'm not on YouTube.
You have a project.
Single project is making sure that my teachers still teach and my students still learn until COVID is behind us, as much as it can be behind us. So that's the heart of where I am right now. I feel like people normally say, if you want to follow me, go here. I'm on Facebook. That's about all I can offer you. Before we get to the questions from the guests, I had a question I wanted to put towards the panel. Could I do that in a second, Jason?
Yeah, sure. Why don't you tell us a little bit about VanDamme Academy, and then sure. I'd love for Ray to tell us about higher ground stuff, and then I will grant you the first question of the question period.
So VanDamme Academy is a K-8 school in Aliso Viejo, California. It's a very small school, 140 students. I like to tell people that we like to keep it as large as a healthy tribe, so that everyone knows each other and I know everyone's name and face. We teach as I've been saying before, we teach core subjects and what we call the core competencies and core materials. So it's history, math, science, and literature, writing, and so forth. We have a no homework policy, another very interesting thing about our school. And we try to hire specialist teachers that are truly in love with their subjects, so that every child knows that the next teacher that comes through the door is a master of that material, loves that material, and is going to give them some rigorous challenges in an exciting way. And then we make sure that the assignments stay inside the classroom so that they don't have the dread of homework every night, which means we can give richer, more writing-based assignments rather than things that require a textbook for every answer. I don't know. I feel like I wasn't ready to give an off-the-cuff description like this. I'm just giving my sales pitch from tours of the school.
That's great. No, that's great. That's what I wanted to hear. By the way, Kyle, if you missed it in the chat, this is just too hilarious. I thought you said a no homer policy.
Forget about that.
I clarified.
I tell you, he's just a warmonger. No.
All right.
And
I follow these folks on Twitter and Facebook, and so I've seen the wonderful reactions of their students and how much they really love the school. So it's really wonderful what they've created. Ray, tell us about Higher Ground, and you probably won't be able to cover all of your projects and brands, but maybe a few of the highlights.
Yeah, I mean, just at a high level, I mean, we're going for scale. We're trying to really get education right at scale. And the problems that we've talked about and the problems of education are so complex that I think that, you really only can solve them at scale. I mean, I was at a conference, someone was like, that has 3 schools. Like, how are you opening 30 schools a year? And my response was, how are you opening 3 a year? how much harder it is to open 3 a year than it is to open 30 a year, just because the division of labor and the talent and the people that you need. But basically, we're opening, Montessori. We're essentially neo-Montessorians. We're opening Montessori-informed, Montessori-inspired schools from infancy at 3 months old all the way through high school. We'll have about 80 schools across the country, and 7 more in China. And we have a federally accredited teacher training program at every level from infancy to adulthood. And it's a network. And my 2 kids have been to 20 cities, because whenever I travel, I take them with me. And we really thought about how to make that seamless. We want the modern millennial professional with kids. If you have to travel, business travel, take your kids with you. We train nannies for at home. We have tools for stay-at-home parents. And the idea is really to be that village that supports the parent in raising the child. The business case is we have the world's most expensive subscription. People are paying us $10,000 or $20,000 a year for hopefully 18 years, right? If we kind of capture them at the run in. And so,
SaaS business ever.
Yeah. Tell me about it. And then the value of that is you can build entire businesses just to acquire customers and impact millions of people, because you just need a tiny sliver of them to upstream. We really care about the kind of pedagogical issue that we're grappling with is how do you impart a definite set of content and skills that adult human flourishing require while uncompromisingly respecting the agency, and the kind of self-creation of the child. And that, we see the landscape as people, on one side or other of this false alternative, and that, our kind of mission, our defining quest in life is really to synthesize the two and figure out how to do that from infancy again all the way to adulthood. And we're doing a project with you, Jason, Progress Studies for Young Scholars.
That's right.
That's
So
kind of part of this mix. Yeah.
I'll go ahead and give the pitch for that. So I believe after this panel was conceived, but a couple of months ago, Ray reached out to me and asked if I'd be interested in creating an online summer program basically in the history of technology, aimed at the high school level. And I jumped at the chance. I've known Ray for about 20 years now. And ever since I went full-time on Progress Studies about 9 months ago, we'd just been kind of looking for an excuse to work together. And so a couple months ago, we launched this thing called Progress Studies for Young Scholars. I'll grab that website. It is progressstudies.school. And the basic program is a 6-week sort of daily program covers the broad history of technology, things like manufacturing, agriculture, energy, transportation, and so forth, and sort of what were the key inventions and discoveries that made the modern world. There's kind of daily reading assignments, about an hour's worth of reading a day, and then an hour a day of live online discussion and Q&A led by an instructor. It's been really well received. You can see the testimonials from both students and parents. One student called it the highlight of her summer, which was very gratifying to me. And we are going to be keeping it going into the fall, I think, as a homeschooling and or sort of after school program. And we've also gotten, by popular demand, we've gotten a ton of interest from adults who say that they would like to do this even though they're no longer in high school. So we are creating something at the adult level as well, which we will be announcing soon. Okay, so great. Let's go to some of the audience questions. Kyle, I promised you the first one, so go ahead. What's the question you'd like to pose?
Well, all of the people on the panel have talked about the importance of looking at education from the level of the individual student, and how does what we teach benefit them and make their futures richer and brighter. And I was curious what the thoughts were, and Jason, I'd like to hear from you as well. How would what sorts of things would progress studies offer a child at the individual level, rather than how progress studies might make culture or society better? What would it do to make the individual child's life and future better? I'm putting everyone on the spot with that one.
Yeah, sure. I'll start. I think when I think about what is the purpose of my work right now with the Roots of Progress, I want to change the way people see the world. And I want them to look around and see the world with a lot more appreciation and gratitude and wonder, really. I want them to look around at every man-made thing and see it as a solution to a problem that we once faced and grappled with and suffered from and sort of, muddled through. And at some point, somebody solved that problem and came up with a better way of doing things. And now all of us have inherited that solution. And, and so now we don't trudge through deep, muddy, rutted streets to get to the store. We can drive cars on paved roads. And we don't lose our children at the age of 4 to smallpox because we've eradicated that disease and wiped it off the face of the earth. And we don't have to worry about whether there's a famine coming this next season if there's been bad rains. We can just open our refrigerator every morning in our bathrobe and slippers and get fresh fruit, out of the drawer and make fresh coffee. And, all of these things, I would just like to impart a little bit of, like I said, wonder and gratitude to everyone. Maybe you don't literally think about it every moment of every day, but I would like to instill something in everyone that they can turn on at any moment and just remember that we didn't always have these things and sort of where they came from. And I think that perspective on the world, that's like the most basic thing that I think can add to every individual's life.
I think.
Yeah, I agree.
Please.
I was just gonna say, I think it's the individual stories. I mean, it's the way people read biographies. I mean, this is humanity at its best, right? Rising to the occasion, and it's not art, but it's pretty. I don't know. For me, it's pretty close, right? Like you read the Microbe Hunters, right, and you see the story of all these biologists that were injecting themselves because they were so confident in kind of their views. And so it's just, there's something about the sheer, celebrating the sheer sight of human beings figuring things out.
I could imagine that with a rich study of this part of history that they can start to look at their own lives and their own world as an ample ground for innovation, that the problems that they trudge through every day, they can start to improve and make things better even in their own local environment, maybe drawing from what they're learning from these pieces of history.
Yeah.
You have to fundamentally choose at some point, or it adds up to a view of human beings as capable and as efficacious, or human beings as incapable of living. I mean, everybody has a kind of latent implicit view of that. And so why go and examine all of this data? I mean, and what is the value of arriving at the view that human beings are capable, are able to solve things out, are able to kind of manage and succeed? I think that we could, there's a lot, right? There's a lot in terms of your personal life. There's a lot in terms of your confidence and your own choices. But at root, I think it's really about the value is that orientation.
Thanks for letting me indulge my curiosity on that.
Yeah, sure. I do think there is also something about, I mean, just as there are many things that we get from a study of history, but I think one positive thing, I don't know exactly where it ranks, is inspiring stories of great achievements. Mm-hmm. And I think that scientific, technological, and industrial achievements rank up there with political achievements, in that, at least some of them sort of deserve to be listed and are a thing that people can draw great inspiration from. And they are not always a thing that society valued. there was a great quote which I really need to go memorize so that I can repeat it in times like this. But it was something about Britain erecting a statue of James Watt, who invented a more efficient steam engine. But there was some line about the statue. The part of the purpose of erecting the statue was to show people that an inventor could be a benefactor of mankind and was worthy of a statue, just like a great warrior or general or king or prime minister. And so I think those. But kind of coming back to the question about what does it really add to the we're not just cultural engineering here. If we are looking to add to the individual's life, I think just giving them more heroes. And I think that's a worthy goal.
Mm-hmm.
Lisa, do you want to add anything?
I don't think I haven't anything to add.
All right. Well, let's turn to some audience questions. David Doswell, if you're still around, I feel bad for shouting you down before, so let me invite you up to ask the first audience question if you got anything on your mind.
I feel bad for coming late and not knowing the etiquette of
No, that's quite all right.
I literally just support anything you and Anna do. So when I show up, it's always just shambolic and I don't know what's going on and I'm lost. I don't know. I have probably 1,000 questions because I was around early on when you started this project and I was trying to, I remember when you asked me like, what are your thoughts on progress? And we were having coffee and I just was like thinking about it and going, that's a big question. Then I went off on something completely different than what you were thinking, and then we kind of reconciled back. I want to talk about, I guess, because we're talking about children, progress studies, if I understand it correctly, and correct me if I don't, I think I'm directionally correct because I care about progress just in my own life. It's mostly about understanding how we got to now. And I mean, not just why, but how. And so to some extent, progress studies is about how to build the future, like deliberately. This is why history is not progress studies, right? With a very particular, I think, bent toward, okay, now that we eradicated smallpox, how do we eradicate endometriosis? Like, how do we take the skills that we have, the tools, the methodologies for reasoning, for doing math, for doing testing and experiment to solve bigger problems that are facing us now. We'll always have problems, but they should be less contractible as we get older. And my question is, wouldn't progress studies make us, or children at least, if they're taught correctly, more civically engaged? Because people like me who are a little more sort of market oriented and detached from the state, because I think it's not just incompetent, but the way it's set up is no longer effective for serving a very large, diverse group of opinions of free people, unlike the sort of 13 million who washed up on Atlantic tidewater some 250 years ago. Wouldn't children, if they're taught where we come from, why this, sanitary system exists, how come, like, what's it mean to get a shot, what's the vaccine, like, and then when it comes to cities and things, like, how come the street is set up this way? How come we have to, engage in building something new this way? Wouldn't this make them more civically engaged in how to, enact policy from a perspective of building something that's efficient, that's cost effective, that is more durable over time?
Okay, so to boil that down, or Lisa, do you have immediate thoughts?
I think I have. I hope I'll address the essence of the question, but I think I recognize exactly the value you're describing. I think it's an enormous value. And I think the question of education always is to what degree and at the expense of what else. So it seems in my mind like if you took a few of those things and taught them exceptionally well in the context of a history or science curriculum, what the child would then know is that a similar story must exist for all things. And to the extent that they're exceptionally interested in that as a personal interest or as a career ambition, then they can take the progress studies course after school or focus on that somehow extracurricularly. But to the extent it's been covered well at all, it will be something they apply to all other circumstances after that. And then the danger, I think, of spending too much time on that subject is there are so many other aspects of education that are equally important that we have to make sure we take the time to give them. And that's always the danger. Anytime you make a compelling argument for the incredible empowering value of this one subject area, that becomes your focus, and you always have to be careful to say, okay, what gets forced out by giving it that attention.
Why is art okay as a subject to focus on when it doesn't have the same direct application to other people, especially when we're talking about art appreciation?
Oh,
Why
wow,
does
David,
art-
you have no idea what you have unleashed.
Why does art deserve a place at the table with progress studies? Is that
No, why is it considered like a fundamental part of a curriculum with, like, say, English or language for that matter, and math?
Why does literature, why does art or in general, or literature in particular, deserve to be part of core curriculum, right? Which is, I love Lisa, how you're just so keenly aware of the budget, like the time budget. Like I only have so many hours in a day. And so so you've got this, you have this strict view of what goes in core curriculum. So yeah, why?
First, I'm going
to
evade the question for a second and just say, yeah, we have this ruthlessness about the school day in part to facilitate that no homework policy, which is not just because kids will be super excited and it's an easy sell because they get to go to a school with no homework. At one point in this discussion, my husband passed me a note and said, you know, they have more time in their schedule, and what that's supposed to do is open them up to these individual pursuits once the core curriculum has been covered. So if they're given the fundamental skills that are going to empower them in all aspects of life, whatever their endeavors, and then you give them free time to specialize, that's a very empowering thing.
If Beethoven doesn't have Beethoven doesn't have homework, he can go home and he can play piano 8 hours a day. Yeah, right.
Yeah. So I'm supposed to answer in like maybe 2 minutes why art deserves at the place at the table.
There's a culture
I'm here to
of
support you, Lisa. I'm
not
here
a
to
culture
support
of...
you if there's
Okay. Well, so I mean, this is what I've devoted my life to, is showing people that art deserves a place at the table in every individual human life, and that it will enhance your experience of and enjoyment of life, no matter who you are, no matter what you're interested in, no matter what your subject is. And that's a tough sell sometimes, because the experience most people had with art or literature in school completely contradicts that. It was tedious and boring and unstimulating and dreary, and it did not give them that experience at all. So I'm working to counter that experience and try to show through example, but I mean, this is that trying to abstract the essence of it without giving you the experience of it first. I feel like the experience of it has to come first, and then I can abstract the essence of it. But to try to do that abstractly, I would say that there are some monumental minds across the history of mankind who had a unique, distinct power to look out at the world, to strip it down to essentials, and to help you focus on, appreciate, understand aspects of life that make it, empower you to live it successfully and make it feel intensely worth living. So when somebody reads a great work of literature and has the lens of that artist to look out at the world, their experience of life is transformed both in particulars, because they see things about the world that they never understood before, and in principled practice, that they know how to look out at the world and extract that essence from it in their day-to-day life. So I think reading great art helps you to look at your life like an artist, and looking at your life like an artist means achieving actually a lot of the things, Jason, you were describing as your goals with progress studies, really relishing, seeing the value in life as you know it and relishing that value. And I think people who are really steeped in great literature are exceptionally good at doing that, and at bringing to bear a lot of wide-ranging and ingenious perspectives on life experience. So that's the best I can
I
do
would
off
add, yeah, and I would add, I don't have the expertise in terms of the answer, but in terms of the question, like, you have to ask, like, what are the needs of a human being? And the needs, like, and like, some needs are more fundamental. There's a need to size up people and situations. We encounter forks in the road, and to kind of be able to see and hold on to what matters, what is important. Am I going to make a stand here? Am I not? You know, to judge other human beings. And everyone has to meet this need. And whether you get it from conversations and movies and on the fly because you didn't get it at school, or whether you get it in a systematic way, you know, the need is more fundamental and less derivative. And so I think that's the, you know, you might disagree with that, but that's the way in which you would evaluate whether it's included or not, right? In terms of like how broadly and how deeply does it speak to kind of you know, the needs of human flourishing.
I feel like this is a challenge now that I need to accept. I've got to convince David that he needs part of it.
This is great.
I think they're both important.
Okay,
I mean, I'm an artist, so I know. But yeah, thank you for your answers. Thank you.
All right, great. So let's move on now to the questions from the Slido. So our most upvoted question is from Ben. Ben, do you want to just unmute and maybe just ask this in person? Starting with the quote is progress good, end quote.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, so the question of whether progress is good is a very value-laden question. And I'm curious whether that makes it hard to unpack in an academic context, at least the way it's currently set up, where disciplines are very partitioned. Because it, like, so much of the question gets deep into philosophy, and like it seems like you need to be able to have a clear conversation at that level, in addition to having to understanding the science and the history and the more material elements. And I suppose, you know, I'm very much you know, what Jason says about the awe and inspiration of progress really resonates with me, and I think that's one of the sort of attractions of progress study. But those emotions are value-laden things. They're not elicited by a mere sort of descriptive analysis of material progress. And so, anyway, that's sort of a long-winded way of saying, how do you think this this question can be addressed in schools?
Mm-hmm.
Since I've taught history and talked about especially progress throughout history, I can tell you how I've tried to approach that practically. The first thing is, even if you were trying to be completely value neutral as much as possible, and you're just trying to teach the 18th and 19th century and 20th century as such, it's clear that the biggest movement in that period is what we call progress and the impacts that it had. So you're going to be, if you're an honest historian, no matter what your values, you're going to want to, you need to talk about the developments in terms of the political and technological developments during that period specifically. And then as for how to approach the question of value, like, is it good, and do you try to convince the kids that it's good? I try to be as sober and neutral as I can in my discussion, and I often find I don't need to do much to sell them on it. And so when I'm talking about the Industrial Revolution, I'll also talk about the Luddites and the saboteurs. You know, I'll talk about the people that are the opponents of it, the grievances that came out of that period of history, and you know what, and how they tried to destroy the mills, and then what happened as a consequence of that. And so I think that, you know, the history to some extent speaks for itself, and that I think it deepens and enriches their appreciation of the past. If you also talk about the kind of the counter-industrial revolution or the critiques of those developments, it makes it more interesting when there's an antagonist and you're teaching history, and it will also get them to think about the impacts of each new innovation more deeply.
Great, thanks.
I think you're getting at the problem I was indicating before too, in regard to education and parenting, that at some level, I feel like the whole project of education, at least as I understand it, depends on and implies certain values. But it's at what level? And so, and I don't have that clearly conceptualized in my own mind. I feel like I have a vague understanding that shapes my own approach. And it's something like, it's premised on Enlightenment values to a certain extent. You know, if we're not agreeing that reason and, you know, human flourishing, and if we're not agreeing that those shape our goals in engaging in education in the first place, then I think we're left with no standards by which to define even selectivity within any given subject. But then striking that balance between the kind of values that get the whole project started, and then imposing particular values on the student, differentiating those categories, I think is the really challenging thing. And I always want to be cautious not to be too prescriptive.
Yeah,
but not to deny that there are fundamental values shaping what I'm teaching.
Yeah, it's an issue that comes up in other domains, like so free speech, like free speech as an example. Like a lot of areas in which you want to be like value neutral and let people define their own approach are deeply value laden, in fact, right? The underlying framework. And so, I mean, this is I think the best example, and in a way it's an exact analogy, is, you know, the American experiment and the Declaration of Independence. It's like, we're going to create a system that allows people to, you know, to decide and self-determine their own life. And that system is both deeply value laden and it has a priority of not minimizing the imposition of that value on people. And I think there's something very parallel in education. And so you can both believe that, you know, that progress is good, and believe that it's important to resist the temptation to tell our students that progress is good. And actually that's very I think consistent, and there's some sense in which the conflict is just apparent. Like there isn't, you know, I don't think there is a real conflict between.
Great. Okay, let's move on. Question from Jonathan about relation between progress and mental well-being. Jonathan, you want to ask it?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the great discussion. You guys touched on this a little bit in your answers to Kyle's question, but I'm curious what impact you think an understanding, appreciation of progress has on a student's just general outlook or mental well-being. I've experienced in my own life, just the more that I've studied history and the progress of humanity, that I've become more optimistic. Like, sure, there are very real problems that exist today, but in a sense, like the past, there were even more challenging, more difficult problems that existed. And I'm curious if you've experienced in teaching students, like what your experience has been in their general outlook. Have you had students who are like very pessimistic about the situation of today and have become more optimistic about the future?
So I don't have that kind of a read on my students if I've had that kind of an impact. But I do think that someone that believes that they have agency is going to be more psychologically healthy. And if they believe that the world is a place where they can grow and thrive and improve, they're going to be more psychologically healthy. So there's a lot of things in this progress perspective or mindset that I do think are compatible with psychological health. And then as a teacher, I'm not oblivious to the psychological health of my students. but I don't necessarily see myself as having a therapeutic role with them. So does teaching them about the history of progress or similar themes in literature, can it have a beneficial psychological impact? Absolutely. But I don't know if it wouldn't feel proper for me to set that as a primary goal. Maybe it's like a tertiary perk to the instruction.
One thing I would say is that to the extent you experience that there might be something about progress studies distinctly that especially gives you that feeling of optimism and empowerment. But one thing I can tell you I've experienced very dramatically is what it's like for a student who was at a dreary, memorization-based, utterly boring school and transferred to our school and found themselves with passionate mentors able to guide them through tremendously empowering knowledge in every different subject. And then I think that has a profound psychological impact on them. So it might be that there's something distinctly valuable about progress studies that helps to achieve that goal, or it might just be any real meaningful mastery of understanding and some skill that gives you a new lease on the world is going to have that effect of making you feel more optimistic, because I definitely feel like I've seen that in my literature classes. It's a different approach and a different effect, but it's still, if you read about heroes and you're, understanding life through the mind of a genius, it makes you feel more empowered to live a happy and successful life.
Ray, do you want to add anything before we move on?
Yeah, there's a real issue here, and it is the issue of the modern age, right? You see it in, Wordsworth and Tennyson. The whole story is like the alienation that results, the separation of like material progress from like the world of values, and I think that's being played out writ small in a lot of teenagers' experiences. And so I'm not sure if you would kind of like bucket that under progress studies, but there is a need. What progress in a way does is highlight the fact that you have agency. Not that we ought to have agency or we should be given agency. That we do as a matter of fact, and you get, and then you get the kind of concern with the tyranny of the either or, and the whole perspective of like, like maybe I don't actually want agency, right? Maybe I just want to be told what to do. Like, and you see this playing out over the last 250 years, right? And so, I think it's a very interesting issue, and I think that it has more to do with how we as a civilization kind of answer the question, of kind of what gives life meaning generally, then how do we apply that to education or to teenagers? Like, if we don't have a general answer, we don't have a general account, then we're not going to have any idea about how to apply it, right? And I don't think we do, at least out there in the world. Like, there isn't kind of, it isn't a reconciliation. I think there is in reality, but I don't think it's out there.
Anna, you wanted to add something?
Yes, sorry, maybe it's unusual that I jump in here, but as you guys were talking about optimism and all these different ways in which we can be optimistic based on the past or just projecting our desires onto the future. I grew up in Budapest. I grew up in kind of late communism, early post-communism, and you always feel this weird kind of two-faceted situation there when it comes to optimism. On the one hand, we feel like, oh, we're this super small landlocked country in the middle of East Central Europe, but we produce this enormous amount of, inventors and Nobel laureates, and we kind of have like this genius image. It's even though like everybody had to immigrate because we chased them away, we still like, those guys are ours, but they were winning Nobel Prizes for the US or Australia or anybody else who wanted to kill them. But on the other hand, we have this history where everybody colonized us, invaded us, and defeated us, right? So the entire history education, so you have the scientific history education, which is like, yay, yay, win, win, win. And then you have the kind of military history education, which is like down, down, down. We tried revolution. And so you kind of have this weird sense. And I think overall, the stories of defeatism and defeat win. If you look at the current psychological makeup of the society there, I mean, somebody winning a Nobel Prize in 1961 for some rocket work is not going to get people out of bed in the morning and make them happy. But knowing that, you know, we can also create a society where that will be welcome, where you can, you know, you can invent things and create change. I think that combination could work. So, you know, when you guys bring up the kind of dichotomy of like scientific progress and social progress, when it comes to optimism, to me, they have to go hand in hand. And I have an entire country as proof to show.
And I just put a link in the chat. There's a good Slate Star Codex blog post titled "The Atomic Bomb Considered as a Hungarian High School Science Fair Project," where he talks about the unusual influence that all these Hungarian intellectuals had on this.
And they all studied under one math teacher. One math teacher made all the geniuses, from Erdős to Wigner to Neumann, everybody. It's crazy.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. We're going to keep going to the bottom of the hour.
When they were becoming geniuses, the Hungarian mathematicians and physicists, that was in an optimistic time. That was between the two world wars, where they had reason to believe. We don't know if they had actually gone on to study math and work so hard as like 14, 15-year-old kids, instead of like throwing, you know, balls outside, if they hadn't had reason to believe at the time that there will be a social base for that work.
Sure. There's also it's very interesting this when you see these like this density of talent, like you have these small Northern Ontario towns in Canada where I grew up that produce like 7 NHL players, even though it's like a town of 1,000 people. And like, it's very relevant to the question of education and the question of culture. Like you know, and I feel like this happened to me in terms of the people that are in kind of they've been in the same circle for, you know, 20 years, where you just mutually reinforce like these kind of this optimism or this positive view or whatever it is. And it's a topic for another day, but I think it's at play in some of these conversations.
Okay. Next question from Gina. Do you want to unmute Gina and ask your question?
Yeah, I feel like it's actually been addressed to some extent, because I was groping at this issue of the confound between the values underlying a desire to teach about progress and the valuing of a particular kind of human life and a particular set of outcomes on the one hand, and the kind of methodology that you guys were describing earlier, especially, you know, Ray, the triad you described, that you could be focused on opinion or propaganda or thinking. And I guess to the extent that you haven't already commented on it, like, do we think that certain values held by the educator are correlated with, or is there some interesting kind of causal relationship there that we should attend to between how you think about, you know, like the best human life and the kind of methodology that you think, you know, that you would want to practice?
I mean, I think that the simple thing I would point to is just intent. And, you know, intent takes you a long way. Like if you're intending to help this child become his or her kind of best adult self, that's your motivation. I mean, I don't think there's a strange way in which I don't think education or parenting is such a delicate science. Like if you really mean well, and you get a few things right, like your kids are going to be fine, right? Like I can't actually believe that given my career, but like I struggle with that question, because I do think like, you know, like a lot of it is about just a few basic things and intending, you know, just be conscious of not imposing your, you know, some other motive on, you know, onto kind of your work. You know, if you're clear on that and you reinforce that and you preach that to the choir over and over,
Yeah.
think that
Yeah, I guess Lisa was saying earlier about kind of values at different levels, that you can be value neutral, right, with respect to the specific content that you're conveying, but you are fundamentally, like, at minimum, you have to value individual human flourishing, and you have to view thinking as being somehow causally relevant to human flourishing.
Right. If I were trying to approach that question in history, which I'm not because I'm not a history teacher, but if I were, I would be trying to very carefully define, okay, this would be starting from the point that we accept that history is an intellectual discipline that it's important for kids to possess. So starting from that point, I would say, okay, if that's true, what does that mean exactly? And what is the best approach to take to help them to develop that particular discipline? And this is something that is an enormously complex question that has to be worked out through the influence of writers on a million different topics coming together, the best minds coming together to define those standards. So then if the standard is, what's the best way to help a child develop the capacity to understand history and think like a historian, then you look at where does the study of progress, as in terms of industrial and technological progress, where does that come in to the achievement of that goal? That's how I would look at it.
I think it's a really interesting question of what is the role of values in teaching, and the dichotomy that Ray outlined earlier, where like you're just telling them the taboos and they must follow those taboos, or it's completely open. Resolving that is something that I think I understand, but I'm not completely satisfied with it. But one thing that I've really noticed is the sorts of values that seem to resolve that have something open-ended about them. And the disciplines that seem to fit best into that, there's something open-ended. So when you're teaching mathematics, you're not teaching it because like, we know all the mathematics and I need to teach you the right mathematics. And you will then teach the right mathematics to the next generation. It's an open-ended field and more could be added on to it. And so, and similarly, when we look at the children, we're not ambivalent to what they value and what they become, but we're very open-ended about what they value and what they become. And so we hope that they have a life of flourishing, but we're open-ended about what that looks like. I feel like when you see a teacher that is very narrow and closed off about what values they're teaching, that's getting more into the taboos and indoctrination category. But when the teacher has values which encourage more open-ended thought and discussion, that's moving towards a more healthier way that values are influencing the teacher.
I really like that formulation, Kyle. Not ambivalent, but open-ended.
Mm.
Okay. Next question from, sorry, I don't know how to pronounce the name. Awais? You have a question about progress and stagnation.
Yeah, thanks. You pronounced it correctly. It's Awais. Yeah, so thanks everyone for the discussion. I thought we had I learned a lot about like education, and talking to like educators was super helpful. My question was more around the progress side, because like my understanding of where progress studies comes from, or like why it's important, is against this backdrop of like what Peter Thiel argues is like stagnation. So like since 1970, it feels like things haven't been improving as much as we expected. So like ways that this is formulated, I think Patrick Collison has a blog post called Fast that's about all of the like infrastructure projects that were executed really, really quickly, like, 100 to 200 years ago. And now it seems like if you want to build a train station, it takes 50 years, it's over budget, it never actually works out. I think like Peter Thiel's quote is that we were promised flying cars and we got 140 characters. And basically like this argument that like apart from like bits, apart from computers and Silicon Valley, everything else has kind of stagnated. And most people think that their children's lives are likely to be worse than their lives were. They won't be able to afford houses, they won't be able to afford college, all this kind of stuff. So I'm curious if people have thoughts about this like stagnation angle with regard to progress studies, and that being the motivation for why progress is so important.
Well, the 140 characters really speaks to me, because I I've taken to saying recently that the world has degenerated into a battle of memes. And that's the level at which we're engaging and interacting with the world. Just very emotionalistic, superficial at the surface level, instead of deeply, thoughtfully, from a very informed perspective, engaging with questions in the world. So, I mean, rather than narrowly looking at the problem of progress and trying to address it at that level, I do think it's just at a much deeper educational level that we have to approach it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think there is a kind of there's education for adults or cultural education. Like you encounter, and you're like, okay, parents are keeping their kids in a bubble. We're not saying we should be educating 12-year-olds differently, but we're saying we have to advocate and raise awareness in the world for this issue, or any issue. And so I think what kind of Tyler, Cowan, and Patrick were they're trying to recognize is like there's a threat to the world because nobody appreciates like how important this is. And so in bringing progress studies into K-12 education, I think like we're really highly sensitive to the issues involved. But that's a very different point than should we be advocating for it? Should we be educating adults? Should we be writing? Should we be engaging in it? And when what we're doing with Jason is about teenagers kind of outside of a kind of core experience that are interested. From that perspective, like the world needs educating. Like they are going back to the question of like we are all taking for granted the products of a culture and a methodology that we're at war with, right? And I think it is a pretty fundamental issue.
I'm afraid I don't have anything to add to that.
Well, I'll just add something to give a personal answer. I got super interested in the question of progress independently of the question of stagnation. And in fact, for a while, I was a little skeptical of the stagnation hypothesis. I'm sort of coming around to it now. But from my point of view, if progress has slowed down in the last 50 years, and especially if that's because of, we've like dropped the ball, then that to me gives like an extra emphasis to the subject. But to my mind, it's even if that weren't the case, even if progress was just as strong as ever, I think it would still be totally worth studying, and there's still the question of, well, how do we keep it going? This is a question of how do we not drop the ball in the future? And so to my mind, the question of has progress slowed down is much less important than can we speed it up? If it has not slowed down, but we could still speed it up in a way that was sort of good, all else being equal, then we should. Why not, right? And if it has slowed down and we can correct or reverse that, all the more so. On the other hand, if there's kind of nothing we can do, then it becomes maybe less important. But so I got interested in it just because I saw the history of progress as deeply relevant to and connected to big issues that we all grapple with today, and that are a part. I just see it as an important part of understanding the world, understanding where we are, how we got here, and how to shape the future. And I think that's true. Whether or not regardless of what exactly kind of the history of the last 50 years has been, but that does give it an sort of an extra emphasis. Like if anybody was not convinced that we have to pay attention to the causes and the type of environment that creates progress, then if it's true and compelling that we have dropped the ball in the last 50 years, that we've turned our attention away from progress, and that therefore things are slowing down, that's just the proof. Yeah.
I had a quick.
So that's my perspective on it. Go ahead.
I had a quick question, slightly tangential. Lisa, you were saying just in terms of the battle of memes. I mean, have you, I mean, the 3-hour-long podcast, and I mean, have you heard this argument that like television has gotten so complex and where you can have 3-4 episodes just in terms of setting up characters? I mean, do you think there's anything to that, or do you think that's a blip? I'm just curious whether you have a quick kind of thought on that.
I completely understand the question. I'd like to take heart from the desire for longer format discussions, indicating that there is a desire in people that is not being met, and they're sort of being underestimated in some way by what we expect people's attention to be drawn to. But I haven't seen anything that makes me feel like there's a meaningful cultural shift in that way. It still feels to me like a dialogue at a very superficial level for the most part. Yeah, I don't want to end on that note though.
All right, well, does anybody have a more positive note to end on? I'll just let all of you, any final thoughts or, to kind of put a bow on this discussion.
May I?
Go ahead, Kyle.
I think, this has been kind of implicit in a lot of the conversation. I think in terms of education, the thing that you get from progress studies is a history of material progress. And that, like, it's a really, if you think about what's changed in the last 400 years, like, what do you need to understand as a human being? What kinds of questions come up? How's the future going to change? Like that, not like how a political system changed. So I think that's more fundamental. Not, what has actually happened scientifically, technologically, industrially is people just aren't even curious about it. And that I think it is a product of, I'm not saying that it should be like a whole field, like now education is all about progress studies, but like it is a problem of history education, and that, and I don't think it's an optional one. I don't think it's like students who are super interested in entrepreneurialism can just take this course. It's like a big blind spot, and I think from that, that's the perspective on which, like, not to kind of optimize for progress or create entrepreneurs or any of these things, but to be able to have the capacity to like look at a Coke can and say somebody invented this and why and what problem were they trying to solve. Everything from that to kind of vaccines, and to see it as imbued with meaning and as this human struggle, like that is, I think, part of education. I don't think that this contradicts anything that anybody was saying, but it's like there's a big problem here that's being tackled, I think.
Well, and the positive note that I can add is that I love your project, and I've enjoyed, my little glimpses into the stories and the heroes behind technological developments. And I really see, I see an opportunity here for you to write books, as I know you intend to do, that can influence the outlook that ends up as a part of a history curriculum. That's where I don't see the opportunity fundamentally in offering extracurricular classes, which I think is a great value, and I'm glad you're doing that. And I'm not saying by kind of banning it as its own subject from the core, it has no place. I think its place is in helping to shape a proper historian's outlook on history, or a proper science teacher's outlook on science, in a way that's going to make sure that that is built in to their approach to teaching science or history.
Yeah.
All right. Fantastic. We're a little over time, so I think that's a great note to end on. So first off, thank you to all the panelists. This has been a really fantastic discussion. I learned a lot. Glad we did this. To everybody, okay, so just briefly to remind everybody, VanDamme Academy is VanDammeAcademy.com. Check it out. Higher Ground Education is tohigherground.com. And my project is at rootsofprogress.org. Lisa, Ray, and I are all on Twitter. Kyle, we'll have to get you on. We'll have to pull you into Twitter at some point so we can all have great back and forth discussions. Okay, what we are going to do right now is, metaphorically, if we were all on stage, we are now going to sort of filter out into the lobby where people can discuss. So we're going to stop the recording. This will all go off the record. Our panelists, you are welcome to come out and join mingle with the audience if you want, but you've given us so much of your time that if you want to slip out the back door, that is totally fine. Anybody who needs to leave at this point, actually, totally fine. But anybody who wants to just stick around and kind of jam and converse a little bit more and socialize and discuss, we're just going to make it a little more open discussion. So maybe let's try this. It's been so hard on these Zoom things to give people proper appreciation. Can we just try, can everybody unmute and just give our speakers a round of applause? Let's just see if that works.
We can see it.
The sound.
Okay. All right.
Reminds me of the Seinfeld golf joke. Thank you so much, Jason, and thank everybody who came. I think this was one of the most interesting talks that we've done so far, and just you guys brought up things that I'd never considered. And now what I want to do is like get lost in a variety of Wikipedia rabbit holes. Thank you so much. This was the third episode in our Doing Better series, which is an inter-intellect talk series hosted by Jason. In August, we're taking a break, and then we come back in September with surprises. If you want to, check out our other events, you go to interintellect.com and you can book for salons. We have a bunch of really cool things coming up. Also, Fireside Chats. David Doswell's book has just been published, so he will be talking to us on August 1st. And Nadia Iqbal will be talking to me actually on August the 9th. So if you want to cheer us, please be there. We will also be sending out exclusive excerpts of the book. Courtesy of Strike Press. So we're very excited about that as well. And we have 4 or 5 salons a week nowadays. And maybe Lisa, you can come to be on Team Classics with me, because I'm trying to get people to read 1,000-page long books all the time. And sometimes it's a lonely job. Although the pandemic helped a little bit, I have to say.
Oh, yeah.
So thank you very much. I'm going to stop the recording and we transition to the lobby where you can swear. Take care, guys.
All right.